Hey everybody, welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe, and as always, I've got Sunny here with me.
Hey everyone. And you know how sometimes you look at the numbers and you're just like, wait, what? That's totally been me all week. We've got this huge surge of new listeners tuning in from Spain. Spain? I mean, that's pretty awesome.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, a real jump from across the Atlantic. It really makes you wonder, what got their ear.
Totally. So, first off, to everyone listening in Spain, hola. Seriously, a huge welcome. We're super curious. Where are you guys actually listening from? What brought you here?
Yeah, we'd love to know.
And this is kind of perfect timing, actually, for what we're digging into today. We were wondering, do these big global questions, like about how democracy is working, or even something totally different like AI, do those feel relevant to you over there in Spain?
Exactly the right questions. Because today, we're taking a deep dive into a really big one. Is democracy still, doing what it's supposed to do? We're framing it as, is democracy still working? Spain's story, global view, and the dilemma. And it really feels like something that's on people's minds, kind of everywhere.
It really does. And, the fact that we suddenly have so many folks from Spain joining us feels particularly relevant right now.
Definitely.
Because when you start thinking about some of the head scratchers facing democracies these days, you see these really interesting echoes happening in different parts of the world.
Precisely. And in that context, even something like the situation with Catalonia in Spain can offer a really specific and maybe for our Spanish listeners, a very familiar lens.
Right.
A way to see some of the wider tensions and, questions that are bubbling up in democratic systems all over the globe.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit then. Who gets to decide? It feels like that single question, it really echoes through so many of the big debates we're seeing today.
It really does.
The Catalonia autonomy dispute. It's a really compelling example, I think, of the challenges that pop up in democracies, all over the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially when regional identity bumps up against, the idea of national unity and that whole tricky concept of self-determination.
Exactly. We've got a solid collection of sources here giving us perspectives, mainly from Spain, sure, but also some really fascinating parallels with other places grappling with similar tensions.
Yeah, the comparisons are quite revealing. Really potent example.
Potent, yeah.
It shows those inherent tensions within many democratic systems. When questions about how much, say, a region should have just clash into the idea of a single unified nation.
So to really get a handle on this, we probably need to rewind a bit. Look at the history.
Definitely. We need the historical backdrop. Catalonia, as our sources really lay out, has this very distinct identity.
Language, culture.
Exactly. Unique language, culture, a long history of aiming for more self-governance. And this desire, it really intensified under Franco's dictatorship.
Which actively suppressed Catalan culture.
Right. It was overt suppression. Then when Spain transitioned to democracy in 1978, Catalonia did gain some autonomy through the Statute of Autonomy.
Okay.
But disagreements over how much autonomy, that's been a recurring theme ever since.
A constant friction point.
Yeah. And that tension really escalated after the 2010 Constitutional Court ruling. That ruling actually rolled back some of the expanded autonomy that had been granted in a revised statute just a few years earlier.
Ah, okay. So that rollback was a key moment.
A huge moment. It really fueled the pro-independence sentiment that, ultimately led straight to the 2017 referendum.
Right, the 2017 referendum. And this wasn't just like a casual opinion poll. It felt very deliberate.
Oh, absolutely. The question itself was direct. Do you want Catalonia to become an independent republic? Very clear.
And the Catalan parliament even tried to create its own legal basis. They passed this law on the referendum of self-determination.
They did. They were essentially trying to sidestep the central government's authority, create their own legal footing for the vote.
But, predictably perhaps, the Spanish Constitutional Court stepped in.
Yes. Citing Article 2 of the 1978 Constitution, the indivisible nature of Spain, they declared the whole thing illegal.
And this is where it gets really intense,
Yeah.
The Spanish government's response. It wasn't just a statement.
Not at all. It was a significant, multifaceted, and frankly, forceful effort to stop the vote.
How so? What did that involve?
Well, we saw the deployment of national police, the civil guard,
Yeah.
physically blocking people from getting to polling stations.
Wow.
And there were numerous reports, pretty well documented, of significant police violence. Our sources mention around 893 people injured.
Nearly 900 people.
Yes. And something like 400 polling stations were forcibly closed.
So physical confrontations.
Absolutely. But beyond the physical side, there were major judicial actions, too. Arrests of, I think, 14 senior Catalan officials.
Right.
Seizure of a huge number of ballots. One source puts it at around 10 million.
10 million ballots seized?
Yeah. And they even tried to control the information flow, asking Google to remove referendum apps, restricting social media for leaders like Carles Puigdemont.
So a real clampdown. Information control, legal action, physical force.
A full spectrum response, you could say.
And despite all that, the referendum, it still went ahead.
It did. The results, well, they're definitely controversial. But they indicated that around 90% voted for independence.
90%, but the turnout.
That's the key caveat. Turnout was only about 43%. And it's crucial to remember, as our sources point out, those against independence largely boycotted the vote.
So the result isn't straightforward.
Not at all. Plus, international observers raised concerns about procedures, lack of independent oversight, potential irregularities. So, yes, heavily contested results.
But the Spanish government didn't just, wait and see after the vote. Their response continued.
Oh, absolutely. What came next was arguably an even bigger step, a real turning point.
Which was?
The invocation of Article 155 of the Constitution, for the first time ever.
Article 155, what did that actually mean on the ground?
It essentially meant the central government dissolved the Catalan regional government, dismissed Puigdemont, his whole cabinet.
Took direct control.
Direct control of Catalonia's autonomy. They even appointed the Spanish deputy prime minister as the interim president of Catalonia. And at the same time, they announced new regional elections for Catalonia, but also started legal proceedings against Puigdemont and other leaders.
On serious charges, right? Rebellion, sedition.
Very serious charges.
Yeah.
Which led to some leaders going into exile, others being arrested.
And the king weighed in, too.
Yes, King Felipe VI gave a public address. He condemned the referendum as illegal, damaging social harmony.
Yeah.
But, crucially, he didn't mention the police violence, didn't explicitly call for dialogue. And that omission really angered many, many people in Catalonia.
So the overall effect of these measures, they stopped independence in its tracks, but
they massively deepened the mistrust between Catalonia and Madrid, and it really shifted the whole debate. It became less about just independence and more about fundamental democratic rights, even human rights.
Which brings us to the question, why did dialogue fail so spectacularly? It seems like there should have been off-ramps, moments for discussion.
It does seem that way, but our sources point to some really deep-seated problems. Maybe start with the structural challenges, that constitutional framework you mentioned.
Yeah, Article 2 again, the indivisible nature thing.
That's absolutely key. Article 2 firmly states Spain is indivisible and sovereignty rests with the entire Spanish people, not just one region.
So from Madrid's point of view,
any regional claim to self-determination looks unconstitutional. Full stop.
And this rigidity, it contrasts with other places.
It really does. You look at the UK allowing the Scottish referendum in 2014, or Canada having a framework, even if it's complicated, for dealing with Quebec's aspirations. Spain's constitution just doesn't seem to have that clear legal pathway for a region to pursue self-determination.
Which creates this clash, law versus democracy.
Exactly. That's a phrase one source uses. Catalonia sees the referendum as democratic self-expression, their right to decide. The central government sees upholding the Constitution, the rule of law, as paramount.
It's a fundamental disagreement about principles.
And it's not just a domestic legal debate. It's worth noting. A UN independent expert actually criticized Spain, suggesting that denying the referendum might violate the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Specifically Article 1, the right to self-determination.
Precisely. So international human rights law comes into play, at least in the eyes of some observers. It shows how even well-intentioned constitutions can become real sticking points if they lack ways to adapt to changing regional feelings.
So the Constitution is one major barrier. Then you add the political challenges on top of that, the polarization.
Oh, absolutely. The political landscape was, and still is, incredibly polarized. The People's Party, PP, in power in Madrid then, took a very hard line. Independence was seen purely as a threat. No compromise.
And the socialists, PSO?
They were, in theory, maybe more open to some reforms, but ultimately they did support using Article 155. So not a lot of opposition to the hard line there.
And within Catalonia itself, was everyone united?
Not entirely. There were divisions between different pro-independence parties and also parties favoring more of a federal solution. Different ideas about the path forward.
And crucially, no real mechanisms for dialogue.
That's striking. The central government largely refused to engage with Puigdemont before the referendum. They relied almost entirely on courts and police.
Even when Puigdemont offered to suspend the independence declaration.
Yeah, he made that offer, suggesting talks, but the response from Madrid was basically, are you declaring independence, yes or no? No room for nuance, no space for actual negotiation.
And the media didn't help.
Not really. You had pro-government bias in much of the Spanish national media and pro-independence bias in Catalan regional media. It just seemed to deepen the divides, make rational discussion almost impossible.
So the immovable constitution, the political deadlock, it paints a picture of why dialogue failed.
And then there's the cultural layer. You really can't ignore that clash of identities.
The sense of being a distinct nation.
Exactly. For many Catalans, their unique language, their culture, it fosters this really strong sense of being a distinct nation, separate from Spain.
So the referendum wasn't just political, it was about identity, too.
Deeply connected to identity and protecting that identity alongside democratic rights. But the central government mostly framed it as, rebellion, an attack on national unity.
History plays a part here, too, doesn't it? The Franco era.
A huge part. The memory of Franco suppressing Catalan culture is still very raw for many. So when they saw the heavy-handed response in 2017, for some, it felt disturbingly familiar, like a return to authoritarian ways.
Though, of course, others in Spain see it differently.
Absolutely. Elsewhere in Spain, there's often a strong feeling that Catalan independence would seriously damage the country, economically too, given Catalonia's contribution.
And the emotional element. You mentioned the images of violence.
Yes. Those images and videos spread like wildfire on social media in Catalonia. It fueled incredible anger, shifted the whole conflict much more towards sort of emotional antagonism. Rational debate got pushed even further aside.
It really does feel like a situation with so many tangled threads, making it hard to find a clear path. And, as our sources stress, this isn't just about Spain.
No, not at all. If you zoom out, Catalonia really does look like a microcosm of these bigger global democratic dilemmas.
Like what?
Well, that core tension. Self-determination versus national sovereignty. You see similar disputes playing out or having played out in Scotland, Quebec, Kurdistan, lots
of places.
International law supports self-determination, but
in practice, most established states strongly resist any unilateral secession, citing territorial integrity. It's a fundamental conflict in the international system.
And Catalonia highlights the limits of democracy itself.
In a way, yes. Because when the very definition of the people who gets to decide is contested between the region and the center, democracy itself can become the battleground, not the solution. The referendum showed democracy without consensus can lead to friction.
Friction, even violence, as we saw. Not necessarily resolution. We also see that interplay of globalization and localism.
How so?
Globalization can sometimes worsen economic gaps, making wealthier regions feel, exploited.
Like the fiscal injustice argument in Catalonia.
Exactly. While at the same time, globalization can actually strengthen local identities, paradoxically fueling these independence drives.
And finally, the use of force, its impact.
Yeah, the government might see its actions as legally legitimate, but using force can seriously undermine its moral legitimacy. It certainly drew international attention. Even if the EU officially stayed out, there was clear unease.
So, given this incredibly complex picture, what are some of the potential ways forward? Did our sources offer any solutions?
They touched on a few possibilities. One major one is federal reform within Spain.
Changing the system itself.
Right. Moving towards a model that grants regions like Catalonia much greater fiscal and political autonomy. Maybe looking at how Canada deals with Quebec, for instance.
Has there been any movement on that?
Some initial steps. The socialist government did start a dialogue table around 2020, focusing on autonomy issues. But crucially, independence wasn't on the agenda.
Okay. What else? A legal referendum?
That's another idea, drawing lessons from Scotland. Could there be a path to a legally agreed-upon referendum? But that would almost certainly need major national agreement, constitutional changes, a very high bar.
Seems difficult politically.
Extremely. Then there's the importance of cultural inclusion.
How would that work?
Well, the central government needing to genuinely acknowledge and respect Catalonia's unique culture, tone down any hostile rhetoric. And within Catalonia, perhaps moving away from labeling non-independence supporters as, traitors.
Yeah.
Fostering internal unity, too.
And maybe outsiders could help. International mediation.
That's floated, too. Could organizations like the UN or the EU act as neutral facilitators?
Yeah.
Help structure dialogue, ensure it meets international human rights standards?
Let's dig a bit deeper into those structural problems again, that constitution. It really seems central.
It really does. It creates this kind of democratic paradox. The post-Franco Constitution tried to balance unity with regional autonomy, right?
Yeah.
But its absolute zero-tolerance stance on self-determination clashes fundamentally with the idea of the will of the people, at least as expressed in Catalonia.
And you mentioned the contrast with Canada and the UK.
Right. Canada allowed Quebec referendums. The UK allowed the Scotland one. Even though both failed, the existence of a legal process arguably de-escalated things compared to Spain, where there was no such process.
This question of who are the people, it's not unique to Spain.
Not at all. Think of the Basque Country, Corsica in France. Many multi-ethnic states grapple with this. It links to that globalization trilemma idea.
Yeah.
Can you really have full democracy, national sovereignty, and deep global integration all at once? Something often has to give.
And in Spain, the response leaned towards legal means.
Yes, what some call the judicialization of the political problem. Using the constitutional court, using serious criminal charges like rebellion, to handle what is, at its core, a political dispute about sovereignty and identity.
What were the consequences of that approach?
Significant legitimacy issues, especially after the Catalan leaders were convicted, even though they were later pardoned. It raised big questions about judicial impartiality in Catalonia.
And Amnesty International had concerns.
They did. They criticized the very broad definition of rebellion used in the charges, arguing it could stifle legitimate political protest.
Is this pattern seen elsewhere, using courts for political issues?
We see echoes of it. Turkey's approach to Kurdish political movements, India's actions in Kashmir. Relying heavily on legal and security tools might achieve short-term control, but the risk is long-term erosion of trust and potentially fueling more radical nationalism down the line.
That international perspective is really crucial, too. You mentioned the EU's unease, but non-intervention.
Exactly. The EU was in a very tricky spot. Concerns about the police violence clashed with their fundamental principle of respecting member state sovereignty and internal affairs.
And a fear of setting precedents.
Definitely. Worries about encouraging other separatist movements in regions like Bavaria or Corsica. It's a delicate balance for them.
What about the UN and international law more broadly? Was Catalonia's claim strong there?
It's debatable. As we touched on, while some experts cited the right to self-determination, the standard interpretation of the UN Charter usually limits that right to clear colonial situations or oppressed peoples. Regions like Catalonia, which already had significant autonomy within a democracy, don't fit that mold easily.
And the International Court of Justice?
Their Kosovo ruling suggested unilateral independence generally needs special circumstances, like genocide, which clearly didn't apply to Catalonia. So international law offered limited direct support for secession.
So comparing Catalonia globally, Scotland.
Scotland's 2014 referendum was key because it was legal, agreed with the UK government. The no vote de-escalated things, partly because of that central government compromise.
Quebec.
Quebec's 1995 referendum was also allowed by Canada. It was incredibly close, but the no vote held. Canada later passed the Clarity Act, setting rules for future referendums trying to manage the process.
And Kurdistan in Iraq.
A stark contrast. Their 2017 referendum had massive support internally, but was declared unconstitutional by Baghdad, lacked international backing, and was followed by military intervention that actually reduced their autonomy.
So the takeaway seems to be legality, international support, dialogue mechanisms, they're crucial.
Absolutely. Catalonia lacked that clear legal framework within Spain and didn't get widespread international recognition, which really contributed to the impasse we saw.
Let's talk economics for a moment. That definitely played a role, right? Not just identity.
Oh, a huge role. Economics and regionalism are deeply intertwined here. Catalonia contributes about 19% of Spain's total GDP. That's a significant chunk.
And the independence movement uses that.
Definitely. There's a very strong narrative in Catalonia about fiscal injustice. The feeling that Catalonia pays far more in taxes to the central government than it gets back in services or investment. That this money subsidizes poorer regions.
Is there data to back that up?
Well, Catalonia's GDP per person is consistently higher than the Spanish average. And estimates suggest a net fiscal transfer out of Catalonia to the central government of around 20 billion euros a year, maybe 8% of its GDP. So there's substance to the numbers.
But there are counter-arguments.
Of course. Opponents point out Catalonia benefits massively from the Spanish domestic market, from EU membership via Spain. Independence could bring economic isolation, uncertainty.
And this links back to globalization, wealthier regions wanting more control.
Exactly. Globalization can sometimes fuel that desire in richer regions, Catalonia, Lombardy, and Italy, to protect their wealth. But the idea that an independent Catalonia could just easily rejoin the EU often overlooks the tough entry rules and potential economic shocks.
Were there actual economic consequences after 2017?
Yes, definitely. Around 3,000 companies, including major banks, moved their legal headquarters out of Catalonia after the referendum. That meant capital flight, a drop in investor confidence, and a noticeable slowdown in Catalonia's economic growth the following year.
Okay, so bringing us right up to the present, or close to it, what's the latest? Our sources seem to have info up to about May 2025.
Right. Well, the really intense crisis atmosphere of 2017 has eased, but the core issues are still very much unresolved.
What were some key developments? Pardons?
Yes, a big one was the Spanish socialist government pardoning the 9 jailed Catalan leaders in 2021. That was seen as an attempt to lower tensions.
And the dialogue table?
There was dialogue between 2020 and 2023, focusing on things like more fiscal autonomy, cultural rights. But again, independence was explicitly kept off the table.
And PM Sanchez made deals for support?
In 2023, yes. He reached an agreement with Catalan independence parties for their parliamentary support, promising further steps towards greater autonomy in return. Politics as usual, in some ways.
What about Puigdemont? Still in exile?
Still in Belgium, yes. Though the Spanish Supreme Court dropped the most serious rebellion charges in 2024. He still faces potential charges for misuse of public funds, though. He even briefly popped back into Catalonia in 2024, but had to leave again because of the arrest risk.
And public opinion in Catalonia? Has it shifted?
It seems so. A significant development was the 2024 regional election, where pro-independence parties lost their overall majority for the first time in years.
Suggesting support for independence is maybe cooling.
Polls suggest that, too. Support for independence seems to be around 45%, but a growing number, maybe 35%, seem to favor more autonomy within Spain, with about 20% wanting the status quo. So it's more divided, perhaps less intensely focused on immediate secession.
And the police violence issue from 2017, has that been resolved?
That remains a sticking point. Amnesty International, in a 2023 report, reiterated concerns about excessive use of force back in 2017 and called again for an independent investigation. As far as our sources indicate, the central government hasn't really acted on that yet.
So, looking ahead, future paths, are we just stuck? Or are there ways forward?
Well, revisiting that idea of federal reform is still probably the most discussed long-term structural solution.
But politically difficult.
Very. Strong opposition from parties like PP and Vox. It's hard for the socialists, PSOE, to advance major reforms. But directions could include more fiscal power, like the German Länder have, or more legislative power, like Canadian provinces.
And the legal referendum idea? Still floating?
It's still out there, but again, would need constitutional changes, probably very high thresholds, like a 2/3 majority, maybe even national participation. A long shot, perhaps. Okay.
We'll be back in a jiffy.
Don't go anywhere, folks.
All right, so we're back. So we're seeing these questions about how democracy functions, maybe in Spain, maybe related to Catalonia, but we're also seeing similar kinds of strains elsewhere. Let's maybe hop over to Taiwan for a minute, because they've got a really interesting situation that maybe highlights a different facet of this whole democracy puzzle.
Okay.
This feeling of a disconnect sometimes between what's happening locally, like on the ground, and what the central government is doing, you know, way up in Taipei.
Yeah, and what's fascinating there is that Taiwan has incredibly high voter turnout. I mean, really high rates for both local and national elections.
Those people are showing up.
Oh, definitely. People are participating. But that doesn't always mean everything runs smoothly or that everyone's, you know, on the same page about how the country should be run. There are some pretty clear friction points.
Yeah, it's almost like everyone comes to the big town meeting, but they spend the whole time arguing about what color to paint the town hall instead of fixing the leaky roof.
That's a good way to put it.
We were looking at a few specific areas, right? Starting with something super basic, transportation, getting around.
Right. You see these big infrastructure projects, like extending the subway system in Kaohsiung. We're trying to put the railway underground in Tainan, and they often get stuck, like really stuck for ages. And a lot of the time, it's because the local government and the national government are from different political parties, different teams.
So it becomes political football.
It can feel that way.
Yeah.
Sometimes it seems less about what's actually best for the people who need the train or the subway, and more about which party gets the credit, or maybe avoids the blame for the delays.
Right. And this isn't exactly new, is it? I remember reading about back in 2018 when Han Kuo-yu was mayor down in Kaohsiung.
Yeah.
He had this light rail project idea, but it was just this constant battle with the central government, which was run by the other party, about the budget, about who pays for what.
Exactly. And you hear this narrative a lot, especially in the South, that Taipei, the central government, always prioritizes the North. But then flip side, you also hear accusations that sometimes the local plans are just, well, maybe a bit too ambitious or not practical.
Okay. So local parties might be more focused on just keeping their local base happy, maybe?
That definitely plays a role. Local parties are often really focused on delivering for their core supporters to make sure they get reelected.
Yeah.
And sometimes, that local focus can clash with what might be better for national development overall. It's a very sort of ground-level political calculation.
And then you see similar stuff happening in, like, education and culture, too. These pushes for bilingual education in places like New Taipei City, Taichung. That was a few years back.
Yeah, 2018 to 2022, around then. And on the surface, it sounds great, right? More English education.
Sure.
But they often ran into issues with the Central Ministry of Education's policies, mostly because, well, the local areas just didn't have enough properly trained teachers or the right resources to actually pull it off effectively.
Okay. So good intentions, but practically difficult.
Pretty much. And it gets even trickier when you look at the national curriculum itself. There was this 108 curriculum introduced.
Right.
It puts more emphasis on multiculturalism and, importantly, on Taiwanese history, distinct from mainland China. But it wasn't, let's say, universally embraced.
How so?
Well, you saw different levels of implementation and even some public questioning or pushback, particularly in areas that tend to vote for the other main party, the KMT.
Okay, so this is where education starts becoming like an ideological battleground.
Exactly. Because your view on how history should be taught, what cultural values are emphasized, it often links back to your fundamental view on Taiwan's future. Is it about closer ties with the mainland, or is it about strengthening a distinct Taiwanese identity?
Wow. So even textbooks become part of the political fray.
Absolutely. It turns something as basic as what kids learn in school into another front in these ongoing political divisions.
Which brings us to the really big one, I guess. The core issue underlying so much of this local versus central tension.
The unification versus independence question.
Yeah.
It's central. You see the southern parts of Taiwan, generally more DPP leaning, really emphasizing Taiwanese sovereignty, whereas the KMT leaning areas, often in the north and east, might place more importance on maintaining stable, maybe even closer cross-strait relations.
Yeah, and wasn't there that example just after the 2022 local elections? The mayor of New Taipei City, Hao Yuyi?
That's right, from the KMT. He sort of publicly disagreed with the central government's resist China, protect Taiwan messaging.
Right.
It really shows how this fundamental disagreement about Taiwan's status and future just permeates everything. Almost every government action or policy gets viewed through that lens.
And the danger there, I suppose, is that it can just overshadow everything else, like the economy, environmental issues.
That's a real concern. Everything gets filtered through this unification independence framework. It can force voters into this very binary choice. It makes it harder to have nuanced debates about other critical things that affect people's daily lives.
And then we stumbled across this phrase, this idea of cutting ties after elections and even punishing dissenting opinions. That sounds pretty serious.
It can be quite stark. We saw examples like during the COVID pandemic in 2021, some KMT-led counties like Miaoli didn't fully implement the central government's strictest Level 3 alert measures.
Really? Why not?
Their argument was primarily economic. They felt they needed to keep businesses running, but it led to this kind of uneven patchwork response to a national public health crisis.
Wow. So local economic worries basically overriding national health directives during a pandemic. That's quite a conflict.
It is. And then you get these accusations, these whispers, or sometimes louder claims about punitive allocation of resources.
Punitive allocation, what does that mean? Like deliberately withholding funds?
That's the accusation.
Yeah.
The idea is that the central government might strategically give less funding, fewer subsidies to regions or cities that voted for the opposition party.
Well,
for instance, there were claims back in 2020 that Kaohsiung, after electing an opposition mayor, saw its central funding reduced. Now, whether these claims are always fully provable is one thing.
Right.
But the perception that it could happen, that it might be happening, that alone can be really damaging to public trust.
So what's the end result of all this? These local areas acting like their own little fiefdoms.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
They can become like small kingdoms, making it really hard to implement coherent national policies. And crucially, voters might start to feel like they're being punished simply for how they voted. Like, oh, we voted the wrong way, so now we don't get the new road.
Which really hits at the core of things, doesn't it? It makes you ask, okay, you've got the form of democracy, elections, high participation, but does that actually translate into genuine diversity of opinion leading to good governance for everyone?
That's the key question.
I mean, on paper, Taiwan looks pretty democratic, doesn't it? Freedom House ratings and all that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It scores very well on electoral competitiveness, freedom of speech. Freedom House rated it free in 2024. Score of 94 out of 100. Very strong.
Yeah.
But when you look closer, there are challenges to that, sort of. Substantive diversity. The political landscape is heavily dominated by the two major parties, the KMT and the DPP. They're quite polarized.
Right.
Which makes it really tough for smaller parties, like the Taiwan People's Party, the TPP, to gain significant traction and offer a real alternative power base. So you have choices, but often it feels like a choice between two established opposing camps.
And then you mentioned something about local factions, too, like local power structure.
Yeah, especially in local elections, these established local factions and personal networks can be incredibly influential. Sometimes it feels like your family connections matters more than the actual policy platform a candidate is running on.
So connections over content at the local level sometimes.
It can definitely lean that way. And again, overlaying all of this is that huge unification independence question. It tends to suck all the oxygen out of the room, overshadowing debates on the economy, the environment, social welfare.
So voters get pushed into taking a stance on that one big issue, maybe at the expense of others?
It often forces them into that kind of ideological binary, which leads back to that question you posed earlier.
Yeah. In that kind of system, are we really choosing our future? Or are we just, choosing sides?
A really critical question for Taiwan. And, let's broaden the lens now. Yeah. Because this tension, this dynamic we're seeing in Taiwan, it's definitely not unique.
Right. Let's look globally, because we're seeing this weird paradox in lots of places, aren't we? Like more people might be voting, which sounds good.
Yeah. Participation up in many democracies.
But at the exact same time, trust in government seems to be, tanking.
It's a real head scratcher, isn't it? The 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer really put numbers on this. Globally, trust in government was only around 43%.
Wow, less than half.
Yeah, and in the U.S., it was even lower, about 40%. Yeah. The European average wasn't much better, maybe 45%.
Huh. What about Taiwan, where we just were?
Interestingly, Taiwan's overall trust was relatively higher, closer to 60%. But as we discussed, there's that significant gap between trust in the central government versus local authorities there.
Okay, so why? Why are people showing up to vote but then feeling less trustful of the institutions they're voting for?
It's likely a mix of things. Voters might feel that their single vote just doesn't make a dent in these massive systemic issues like economic inequality or climate change.
Yeah, like the problems are too big.
Exactly. There's also this cynicism, perhaps, that politicians are more focused on winning the next election, the game of politics, than on actually governing effectively once they're in power.
The campaigning never stops.
Kind of feels that way sometimes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the huge impact of increasing societal polarization, often fueled by social media and, frankly, misinformation, which just erodes that fundamental trust in the system itself.
And we don't have to look far from home for another example of these democratic challenges playing out right. Let's talk about the U.S. for a sec, this whole state versus federal power struggle.
Yeah, the U.S. federal system, designed to share power, has seen some really intense clashes recently, especially around hot-button issues. Immigration is a prime example.
Oh, yeah. The situation down in Texas. That SB4 law, tell us about that again.
Right. So in 2023, Governor Abbott signed this law, SB4, and it essentially gave state law enforcement the authority to arrest and even initiate deportation proceedings against individuals they suspected of entering the U.S. illegally.
Which sounds like something the federal government usually handles.
Exactly. That's historically been federal jurisdiction. So this was a very direct challenge to federal authority over immigration enforcement.
A pretty bold move. What happened then?
Well, the federal government, the Biden administration, sued immediately, arguing Texas was way overstepping its bounds. Supreme Court actually put the law on hold temporarily earlier this year, while the legal challenges continue.
Okay, so it's paused, legally speaking.
For now. But that hasn't stopped Texas from taking other actions. They've continued installing razor wire along the border with Mexico, deploying the state's National Guard.
Right, I've seen those images.
Yeah, And it's led to these really tense standoffs sometimes between state forces and federal Border Patrol agents. It's quite extraordinary.
It really is like two different authorities operating in the same space with different agendas. So what's the fundamental disagreement here? Is it just policy or something deeper?
It's definitely deeper than just policy preferences. At its core, you have differing views on the balance of power, states' rights, versus federal supremacy and clashing values.
How so?
Well, Republican-led states like Texas tend to emphasize the concept of states' rights and argue for very strong border security measures. They often view federal policies under Democratic leadership as too lenient, ineffective.
Okay.
On the other side, the federal government argues that immigration is inherently a national issue, affecting the whole country, and therefore federal law must take precedence. It's a national responsibility.
So it's not just should we build a wall here or there. It's a fundamental, almost philosophical clash. Conservative versus progressive views on government power.
Precisely. An ideological clash playing out through policy and legal battles. And when you look at the broader U.S. system, things like the Electoral College, how the Senate works, you see how the structure itself can sometimes lead to outcomes where the person who wins the most individual votes doesn't win the presidency. 2016 being the obvious recent example.
Right. Trump winning without the popular vote majority.
Exactly. And this ongoing conflict between state and federal power, like we see with immigration, leads to this fragmented policy landscape. Things get implemented differently depending on where you are.
Which must weaken the overall effectiveness, right? Even if people are voting.
It certainly can. It weakens policy coherence. So even with active voter participation, if the different levels of government are pulling in opposite directions, the democratic system's ability to deliver results gets hampered.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together. We've looked at Taiwan, we've looked at the U.S., and both seem to point towards this gap between, like, the idea of democracy having elections, fair rules, formal justice.
Right, the formal structures. Taiwan's elections are seen as transparent and competitive. The U.S. has its judicial review process. Those are elements of formal justice.
But then there's the reality on the ground, the substantive breakdown maybe,
right,
where translating those forms into actual effective governance gets really difficult.
Exactly. That's the substantive breakdown. It stems from these deep value disconnects, like the unification issue in Taiwan or the states' rights debate in the U.S. It can involve attempts at central government suppression, though Hong Kong is perhaps a more stark example of where that local autonomy has been severely eroded.
Okay.
And then you layer on top the polarizing effects of the digital age, misinformation. It just makes governing, making collective decisions incredibly challenging.
So the core assumption of democracy, that we make rational choices, trust the system, and it responds, that gets really shaky.
It does. When elections feel more like just picking your team, your side.
Us versus them.
Yeah. Or when the information you're getting is deliberately manipulated, or when the outcomes of elections just don't seem to address the fundamental problems people face.
Then democracy risks becoming less about genuinely choosing our future?
And more about just choosing sides in an ongoing battle.
Wow. Okay. That is definitely a lot to chew on. So here's what I'm left thinking about, and maybe what you listening can think about too, wherever you are.
Yeah.
Have you ever felt that feeling that maybe your vote in the grand scheme of things doesn't really change that much? Or on the flip side, do you ever feel that your local region, your city, your area should actually have more say, more power than the central government allows?
Those are really fundamental questions, aren't they? And as we've kind of explored today, they feel incredibly relevant whether you're listening in Spain or Taiwan or the U.S. or really anywhere trying to make democracy work in the 21st century.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for taking this pretty deep dive with us today.
Gracias por escuchar. Hablemos más.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. Let's talk more. And hey, if you enjoyed this discussion, definitely hit that subscribe button for Sip and Talk.
Please do.
And while you're at it, check out our friend Micky's YouTube channel. He's always got some interesting stuff happening over there. Give him a follow. We'll catch y'all next time.